again.
You don't get much of a break, do you?
No, not with that doctoral stuff. It keeps going.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Let's see. We'll give folks another minute. It could be just us. I'm sitting on my front porch again, so forgive me for any extraneous noises. Like my dog that you probably hear. There's about 4 Muscovy ducks walking about 30 feet in front of his pen, and he sees them and he would really like to eat them.
Duck is delicious.
He's gotten 2 of them. They're so big, these wild Muscovies, they can't get off. They fly like eagles, but they can't get off the ground fast enough because they weigh about 20 pounds apiece. And that dog can jump 6 feet. So he can swat them down, and then when he gets them, those big jaws go on him and it's over. Well, okay. It's about 5 after, so we'll go ahead and call our meeting to order and welcome Nick and Dolores. Thank you for logging in today on a Friday, and Mary, thank you as well. Not much on the agenda today. The new certifications we had drafted and proposed were submitted to the executive committee. And the executive committee, a couple weeks ago, had some questions. And the questions were along the lines of, well, if you're going to allow faculty from a clinical program to be eligible in the BCD revised or clarified criteria, why not allow faculty from BSWs? That was one of the questions. And my response to that question was, well, BSWs by definition are generalist practice and not clinical practice. And then the only master's and doctoral programs that faculty from those that were added were those who teach in clinical programs. So I don't know what their thoughts are about that response, but that was the response given, that if we want to maintain the clinical integrity of the certifications, that we should probably stick with those faculty that teaching clinical programs. And so if they push back on that, and welcome, Douglas. Is there any thoughts on that? Do y'all have any preference or opinions, or would y'all like to offer guidance on that?
Not a social worker, but I'll weigh in. If the faculty member actually is clinical, even though they're teaching BSW, would that be considered?
Well, that was the heart of the question. And my concern with that, and again, I'll cave in pretty easily. I mean, it's not like I'm entrenched in this, but clinical faculty teach clinical material day in and day out, and they conduct research and clinical activities. That's what they do. If you teach in a clinical program, like our doctoral degree and our master's degree is specifically labeled in clinical social work. Well, I teach pathology, I do research and test and measures in pathology and things of that nature. So that's definitely clinical activity. But if you're teaching in a generalist practice program and you're teaching about policy and things of that nature, even though you're clinically licensed, are you really engaged in any sort of clinical activity or educational activity that's related to clinical activity? That was the logic in the response.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if this committee wants to concede that, I'll I'll fold up, like a cheap paper towel pretty quick on that one. I mean, I'm not in any way trying to be rigid. I just wanted to run it by the committee and let everybody know what my response was and then seek guidance on that.
My initial 2 cents, Joel, is I agree with you as well. If we can maybe kind of have that discussion, what is some of that overlap that we do as clinicians, that help kind of foster that care? So, like case management type stuff too, in looking at aftercare, which some of those BSWs look into as well. And I could see that. So if they're instructing that, then yes, some of that overlap stuff. But
Okay.
if it's policy, or if we're looking at, the development or I'm trying to think of the other topics too, like the DS. They wouldn't be even getting into the DSM at that level either. But yeah, if they're some of that stuff, I agree with you on that as well, Joel. That's my input.
Okay. All righty. Anyone else along those lines? Because they had other questions I'll tell you all about.
I'll agree with it as well. This is Dolores. So
Hi there.
hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because BSWs, they do not get to that level of expertise as someone with a master's do. So
Okay.
yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of in line with everyone else. If they're teaching policy, stuff like that, probably not. But I could see a pathway maybe if they're teaching like the practice courses at a BSW level. Because even though it's not clinical, some of the underlying skills they're teaching could inform their clinical practice, right? Like
Yeah, the
assessment.
engagement skills. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So if
Yep,
they
I agree. Well said.
So if they come back on that again, or in the broader board discussion, because part of what I do when I attend those board meetings as a board member is kind of defend what we do. I take the committee's agenda and kind of press it. So what I'll do is put that in there as a caveat if there's a lot of pushback. And to be real transparent, one of the board members is a faculty member in a BSW program. And so that's likely part of the thought process there. I don't know that factually, but if I was kind of a betting man, that's what I would suggest. Another question that was asked was around that BCD. The specialty criteria didn't get a lot of comments at all. But the BCD clarification, another question is coming from public health. Well, can we include quote unquote clinical consultation as an activity that will be counted? And I was a little puzzled by the question. Of course, these all came in email and I don't know any of the background. So when we clarified that criteria to kind of remind everyone, we said that we would count any activity that is authorized by one state's clinical licensure. So if you hold your highest level of licensure, clinical licensure in the state, for example, in Texas, it's an LCSW, whatever is authorized in the scope of practice by the state would be counted as clinical activity, which that opens up quite a bit. And then the second thing we did was we said, if you hold a position, for example, Douglas, if I may use you, clearly you're an active duty and you're a social worker, probably in the United States Army. You probably have to hold a LCSW or your state's equivalent who hold that position in the U.S. Army. It doesn't matter the way we clarified it. If your employer, which would be the United States Army in this case, requires you to have a clinical licensure to have the position, we would count whatever it is you do as clinical activity because your employer said it was. So we opened the door very broadly at that point. So when my response to that person's question was, we are not able to legally authorize a clinical practice. Only the states can do that through licensure statutes and rules. However, if your state says it's clinical, we accept it as clinical. And if your employer says it's clinical, it's fine with us. We're not going to debate your, if your employer requires you to have a license that's clinical in nature, we're not going to debate that. And what that did is it opened up the doors for the VA, because a lot of VA folks are not doing clinical mental health work, they're doing medical, but they're required to have a clinical license. I know when I was active duty, about 3/4 of what I did was clinical, but there was a whole 25% of what I did that had to do with ships and didn't even have to do with the profession at all. I mean, it was more of a active duty military officer kind of thing, as opposed to anything related to social work at all. And then U.S. Public Health, it would include their clinical consulting work that they probably routinely do. So we included all of those things when we opened up that door. And frankly, some states like Texas, education and research is included under that licensure title. So that even opens up that. So when we wrote that or drafted that, we really did open up that door quite wide. And I think folks are wrapping their mind around what that means. My apologies if you hear those ducks. They won't leave. So that was my response to that. And is there any guidance or feedback about those comments?
No, I think opening up the door wide is kind of the way to go here, to be honest with you. If it's good enough for an employer, why shouldn't it be good enough for us?
That's what I was thinking. But to me, that made sense, but because I've held positions in my career that most of what I did was not clinical, but they certainly required me to have a clinical license. And some of what I did was clinical, and so I thought, well, there's no reason to exclude those folks because they have to maintain that license. So what that means is that we're using the state licensure process is the main gatekeeper. And then we build on or tack on our additional criteria after that. Where we get into dangerous land is when we start saying something is clinical that the state does not authorize as clinical. That I think we should avoid like the plague for liability reasons.
I would agree with that. And I would, and to avoid, like you said, liability stuff, if we even said, hey, if something may inform clinical practice too, instead of saying it's clinical, that's the kind of the language that we can use instead of saying that, hey, this is clinical, but hey, this informs clinical practice.
I like that phrase. I'll remember that. And I'll incorporate that. My guess is that I'll need to incorporate that when the board meets as a whole. And when it goes through that process, they're probably going to want me to use that phrase. I think that's a good way to phrase it. Nick, the comments that you revised when you when you made your comments on that draft and I incorporated all of those, none of those were questioned at all, by the way. No one had a problem with nurse practitioners and psychiatric PAs, and no one had any issues with any of those folks being recommenders or endorsers. No one had any problem with that at all. No one questioned the rationale for the 4 new certifications that we chose. In fact, it seemed like folks were kind of excited about that possibility. Mary, I don't know when that board meets or when we meet as a whole again. I think Chuck told me it was quite some time. It would be like June or so. Is that true?
Let me take a quick look. Okay, and now I'm wondering, does Chuck create this committee meeting in the ABCSW calendar or his own? Because I'm not seeing it.
Let me take myself off mute. That would help. I that's okay. I think he indicated it was in June or July, and because it meets quarterly, and I think we met in what, April? So that would be May, June, July, probably around July is what I'm thinking. So that's the time frame we're looking at to get those approved, or at least considered for approval. I think we're going to be successful. I really do. I don't foresee any real hiccups with that process. I did recommend to Chuck directly, and in my response to these questions, that the American board get insurance to protect the board in the certification process. I pressed that pretty hard. I was surprised that we don't have that. And what that insurance does is it protects the board or the organization in the event that a person who is certified either as a BCD or a specialty, which they have to be a BCD to have a specialty, if they get into a problem in a suit or a board complaint and they decide to use the American board as a way to obtain money, or, to include them in the suit or whatever, it would protect the board. So that was recommended to Chuck, and he is checking into that. He felt like that was a good idea. We're looking into that. So we'll see how that, I feel pretty positive about that as well. The only other question that they had is that, well, and I didn't quite understand the question, but I responded best I could, was how do we know these certification folks, truly are capable and all that, do they merit the certification? And my response was, I go, well, first they have to have a clinical license in their state. They have to have, 7,500 hours of, supervision, and only 3,000 of that could be counted towards their licensure. So that's 4,500 beyond that. They have to have their CEUs. They have to be a BCD. Then they have to meet the certification criteria on top of that. And there probably could be a little grandfathering period in the beginning to get them off the ground. That's fairly common and typical, but that seemed to suffice. I didn't get any further questions about that. I think they just wanted to wrap their mind around it because all this was done by email and not verbally. So they didn't have opportunity to ask questions in the moment.
Well, Joel, and I would even to include, so we have all those hours, like you just said, then the CEUs, and we continue to have these layers. And the additional layer too is that we have the employer's qualifications too, right? So we want to make sure we add that, because even then they might even have some more stringent criteria as well. Say, hey, making sure that they are competent within these areas. So, we have the employers, the level for the employers as well. Over.
Yeah, that's right. I know at least from an active duty perspective, there's quite a bit more that has to be done on an annual basis. And I know from an academic perspective in clinical programs, I've got to maintain all my licensure, and I maintain a small practice, and there's all that kind of stuff that goes with it. So yes, I think that's valid too. I'll remember that as well. Well, y'all, that's all there was. That's all the questions that they asked. And is there any new business that y'all would like to talk about or bring up? That's my report from the board, but anything at all y'all would like to discuss?
I don't before the board, Joel, or before the committee here. But if I could have your ear once we are convened, I would greatly appreciate it. Over.
Of course. All right. Well, if there's nothing else from anyone, Dolores, Nick, Mary, anyone at all?
I don't have anything.
Okay. The plan for the future is, once these first 4 go through the approval process and we learn as a committee how that shakes out, then I think we're in a position to propose additional certifications that we have planned, kind of hanging back in the wings. But I was hoping to see how these shake out, because I'd hate to propose others and then these not work out that we have initially proposed. I was kind of hoping to see where they go with it, and I predict success. They seem to be excited, at least from the email communication. But with that, if there's no questions, comments, or concerns, that's all I have. If it's okay, we can adjourn.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Thanks, Joel.
All righty.
And I'll kind of
Thanks,
stick
Joel.
around here for a second.
Sure.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
y'all
See you
for
next time.